Little did I know that a driveway fence would be the start of a shocking coup. At first it was just a petty revenge by Margaret Simmons, president of HOA Lakeshore Estates. But as I dug deeper, shady dealings, money that disappeared without a trace, and homes that were forced to sell at bargain prices began to surface. When the FBI got involved, the veil was torn away. The HOA was not only abusing its power, but also a front for a multi-state money laundering organization. And right at the HOA meeting, Margaret and her accomplices were arrested in front of the entire neighborhood. A seemingly harmless fence was the link leading to the collapse of an entire corrupt empire. If you like this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exciting content. After a long week in Dallas, all I wanted to do was go home, sink into the sofa, and sip my glass of wine in peace. But as my car turned into Lakeshore Estates, I slammed on the brakes. My eyes were glued to what was blocking my driveway. A 6-foot-tall, black, iron fence towered over the garage. A bright red sign blared above the locked gate. Flower violations. Drive away not in accordance with stand. I gripped the steering wheel, my anger rising. This driveway had been there for over a decade, perfectly legal. I had never modified it or committed any violations, so why was it blocked? As I opened the car door and stepped out, the heat from the pavement burned away the last of my patience. Who ordered this? I didn't have to guess. From across the street, Margaret Simmons, president of the Lakeshore Estates HOA, appeared as if she'd been waiting for this moment. Margaret was the type of person who always appeared impeccably dressed, her hair neatly tied in a bun, her suit unwrinkled, her bright red lips pressed together in a haughty manner. She approached with the air of a queen in control of her kingdom, clutching her familiar clipboard, her weapon of choice in every rule-making battle. Standing before me, she tilted her head, flashing the fake smile I'd become accustomed to at community meetings. I knew this had nothing to do with the driveway. It was retaliation. 2 months ago, I had protested the HOA's plan to privatize the boat ramp. Margaret wanted to turn the lakefront into a private playground for the HOA's VIPs, forcing other residents to pay a fee to use it. I had blocked the plan at a community meeting, pointing out that the boat ramp was public property and that the HOA had no right to profit from it. The vote was lost, and Margaret was humiliated, but I knew she wouldn't let it go. And now she had made her move. I looked back at the fence, then back at Margaret, feeling anger rising in my chest. She had gone too far. Blocking someone's driveway was unacceptable, especially when I legally owned it. I clutched my phone, ready to call a lawyer. Then I realized something that made me laugh out loud. I didn't need a lawyer. I was the lawyer. I took a deep breath, held back my anger, took out my phone and snapped pictures of every angle of the fence and the violation sign, and started recording video of the scene. If Margaret wanted to play power games, I would show her what happens when she confronts someone who knows the law better than she does. The sky was starting to darken, the sunset reflecting off the lake, but I was too busy admiring the view. The game had just begun, and Margaret would soon realize she had picked the wrong person to confront. I stood silently in front of the iron fence, the heat from the road making the air even more stuffy. My anger was still burning, but it didn't overwhelm my rational thinking. This wasn't a mistake or a simple misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of revenge. I'd lived long enough in Lakeshore Estates to know that Margaret Simmons anyone who dared to interfere with her plans was quickly targeted, and this time I was the one in the crosshairs. I don't regret opposing the HOA's plan to privatize the marina. The lakefront belongs to all residents, not a privilege reserved for the powerful board members. When Margaret and her cronies tried to turn the marina into a private recreation area for elect members only, I stood up and objected. I pointed out that the marina was public property and could not be monopolized by a small group. When the vote was over, Margaret lost miserably, but I know her. Her silence afterward didn't mean she'd given up. It just meant she was planning a more subtle retaliation. 2 weeks after the meeting, the trouble started. First came the ridiculous HOA citations. One morning, I opened my door to find a white envelope taped to my door. The bold words, "HO violation notice" on the envelope immediately raised my alarm. When I opened it, I found a long list of violations I had never heard of. The garage was painted the wrong color. The HOA approved, even though I had never changed it. The grass was too tall and unsightly, even though I had mowed it the week before. The trash was out of place on collection day, even though I always put it in the right place. And the scariest thing of all was the penalty, $250/day for each violation, compounded until I fixed the problem. I quickly did the math. With 4 alleged violations, I owed the HOA more than $5,000 in just 3 weeks, all for nothing. If I don't pay, the HOA has the right to put a legal lien on my house, forcing me to go to court or even risk losing my home. I know exactly who is behind this farce. Margaret has used her old tactic, financial pressure, to force unruly residents to cave or leave. I've seen this happen before. A young family was forced to sell their home after the HOA repeatedly issued silly violations like window tints that don't match the neighborhood. Another couple was sued by the HOA. Those who don't have the time or money to fight often choose to sell their home and leave, making room for those willing to accept the HOA's harsh control. But I wasn't like them. I was a real estate attorney, and if Margaret thought I would back down over a ticket, she had misjudged her opponent. I immediately gathered evidence, photographed every corner of the house to prove there were no violations, filed all the HOA paperwork, and began reviewing the HOA's legal records. I didn't stop there, but I checked the security cameras, and what I saw sent a chill down my spine. Margaret had been standing in front of my house in the middle of the night 2 days ago, photographing every corner of my yard and garage. She wasn't alone. A man in a black suit stood next to me, pointing toward my boat ramp, making notes in a small notebook. This was no longer a small fight between me and the HOA. Something bigger was going on, and I needed to find out the truth before it was too late. I sat in my office, eyes glued to my computer screen as the security camera footage played back and forth. Margaret Simmons appeared at 11:42 p.m., standing right next to my fence, her phone flashlight beam sweeping across the driveway toward the marina. She wasn't alone. Next to Margaret was a tall, neatly trimmed man in a black suit, holding a small notebook in his hand, taking notes. When they stopped in front of my marina, the man bent down to measure something, then nodded to Margaret before they both disappeared into the night. I pressed pause and leaned back in my chair, trying to piece together what was happening. It was clear that Margaret wasn't just targeting me for personal gain. She had a larger agenda, and I had no doubt about it. It had something to do with the marina. The next morning, I walked by Kevin Morris's house, my friendliest neighbor. Kevin was a former financial investigator, now retired, but he still kept up with the neighborhood. When I told him about the fence and the ridiculous tickets, he shook his head and pulled me inside. On the dining room table, a thick stack of documents was spread out, detailing the HOA's actions over the past 6 months. I scanned the list. 12 lakefront homes were forcibly sold for serious HOA violations. 12 families lost their homes, not because they couldn't pay their mortgages, but because they were repeatedly fined by the HOA, the debt skyrocketing until it was untenable. What was even more suspicious was that all 12 of the homes had been resold at least 30% below market value, and all had been purchased by the same real estate company, Lakeshore Management, LLC. I frowned. The name was completely unfamiliar to me, but the strangest thing was, No one in the neighborhood had ever heard of anyone living in any of the homes after they were sold. I turned back the security camera footage and the image of the man in the black suit popped into my head. If Margaret was working with someone, there was a good chance he was connected to this mysterious company. I typed Lakeshore Management, LLC, into the real estate database. It took only a few seconds to find that the owner of the company was a man named Daniel Whitmore, but there was no information about employees, offices, or any transactions other than purchasing lakefront homes from the Lakeshore Estates HOA. Just then, my phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number popped up on the screen. Check HOA financial records. Things aren't what they seem. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't a prank call. It was someone who knew exactly what was going on. I tried calling the number back, but as I expected, no one answered. I went back to my desk and opened the HOA's official website. By law, all residents had access to the annual financial report, but when I clicked on the HOA budget report, a message popped up. Access denied. I tried again with the same result. A sense of unease began to creep into my mind. There was no reason for an HOA to hide financial information unless they were hiding something, and if someone was sending me anonymous messages, it meant I wasn't the only one who had suspicions. Margaret wasn't just an overpowerful HOA president, she was hiding something much bigger, and I was going to find out. I couldn't sleep that night. The documents from Kevin, the video of Margaret meeting with a strange man at night, the anonymous warning messages, they all pointed to the same conclusion. The HOA wasn't just abusing its power, it was doing something illegal. But I needed more concrete evidence. The next morning, I went to the Austin Department of City Planning, which maintains all the financial records of HOAs operating in the area. Through my professional connections, I was able to request a copy of the Lakeshore Estates HOA's public budget. When the staff handed me the thick file, I immediately realized something was very wrong. With the help of Kevin Morris, a former police financial investigator, I discovered that several lakefront homes had been forced to sell by the HOA in the past 6 months. Oddly, they had all been purchased by the same company, Lakeshore Management, LLC. As I dug deeper, another name popped up, Daniel Whitmore, the company's owner and a man with connections to interstate money launderers. When I checked the HOA's financial records, the truth shocked me. The HOA was spending more than $75,000 a year on lake maintenance, even though there was no evidence that it had ever been maintained. Another $60,000 a month went to Lakeshore Management Services, a company with no physical office. In federal financial reports, I found another company named Whitmore Summit Property Holdings, which has previously been implicated in fraudulent real estate transactions in Florida and Georgia. I also checked the properties that HOA Lakeshore Estates had sold in the past 2 years. 3 lakefront homes that had belonged to residents who had been forced to sell by the HOA were sold to Lakeshore Management Services for 30% less than market value. All 3 homes were strategically located on the lake, like my home, with the best boat ramps for water transportation. As the truth began to sink in, I felt a chill run down my spine. The HOA wasn't just a financial fraud, it was part of a larger money laundering scheme. The foreclosures weren't just abuses of power, they were using the HOA as a vehicle to legitimize illegal real estate transactions, buying up lakefront homes at bargain prices, then using them to launder money through Whitmore's company. And if I was right, the marina was at the center of it. I sat silently at my desk, staring at the documents in front of me. Margaret wasn't just some overbearing HOA power broker. She was running a criminal scheme on a scale far larger than I'd ever imagined. I needed more evidence. But more importantly, I needed to find a way to get this out before they tried to silence me. I sat in my office, the HOA's financial documents spread out before me, each number a piece of a conspiracy far larger than I had ever imagined. Lakeshore Estates not only had a corrupt HOA board, it was also the center of a large-scale money laundering operation. I knew I had stepped into a dangerous quagmire, but I had no idea how deep. Until the FBI came to me. The next morning I was making coffee when the doorbell rang. I looked through the security doorbell and saw a woman in a black suit standing at the front door. She didn't belong there. When I opened the door, she flashed her badge and said calmly but firmly, "This is Special Agent Emily Carter with the FBI. We need to talk." I led her into my office, my heart pounding as she opened a file and placed it in front of me. Inside were aerial photographs of the marina, showing small boats moored at odd hours, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., along with pictures of Margaret and Daniel Whitmore meeting with unidentified men at the marina. Some of the images showed containers being loaded onto the dock without any records in the city's transportation registry. I swallowed, realizing what I was facing. Emily held my gaze as she continued, her voice firm. "We've been monitoring the Lakeshore Estates HOA for the past 6 months. We believe Margaret Simmons and Daniel Whitmore are not only embezzling HOA funds, but are also using the marina to launder money and transport contraband." Her words stunned me. I had suspected the HOA was corrupt, had guessed that they were forcing residents to sell their homes for profit, but I had never thought it involved organized smuggling and money laundering. Emily continued, flipping through more documents. They had traced Whitmore's finances to a series of suspicious transactions in 3 different states, all involving front companies like Lakeshore Management Services. But the problem was that the FBI didn't have enough evidence to charge me directly. They needed more information, and they thought I was the person who could help them get it. I clenched my fists on the desk. Somehow I had gone from being a real estate lawyer to being a key cog in a federal investigation of a criminal organization. But that also meant I was in serious danger. If Margaret and Whitmore found out I was working with the FBI, I had no doubt they would find a way to silence me forever. Emily understood my hesitation. She leaned forward, her voice low. "We'll protect you, but we need you to continue acting like you don't know anything. They've already started targeting you, which means you're a real threat to them. If you help us gather evidence, we can end this once and for all." I closed my eyes for a moment, considering my options. I could ignore this, sell the house, and leave, ignoring what the HOA was doing, but I wasn't the type to run away when I saw injustice. And more than anything, I knew that if I left, they would just continue doing the same thing to other residents. When I opened my eyes, I knew I had made my decision. I nodded to Emily, my voice more certain than I thought it would be. "I'll help you, but if we do this, I want them to pay every last penny." Emily smiled the first time she'd been here. She pulled out a small device and placed it on the table. A panic button, a direct link to the nearest team of agents. I ran my fingers over its cold metal surface, fully aware that from this point on, I wasn't just dealing with a corrupt HOA. I was dealing with a full-fledged criminal organization. I've been to many HOA meetings before, but I've never walked into the room feeling as nervous as I did this time. Tonight, Margaret Simmons had no idea that she was walking into a trap. From the back row, I surveyed the room filled with Lakeshore Estates residents who were tired of the rising HOA fees and the harsh rules Margaret imposed on them. I scanned the room, then stopped in a corner near the door. FBI agent Emily Carter and 2 of her colleagues were there, posing as concerned residents. They were all waiting for a single moment to act. Margaret stepped up to the podium, her fake smile still on her face, her clipboard in her hand. She spoke smoothly, as if what she was about to say was good news. The board of directors has met and has decided that, in order to maintain the high standard of living at Lakeshore Estates, we need to increase the HOA fees by 40%. An immediate wave of disapproval swept through the room. 40% was no small number. For many families, this would be the last straw, forcing them to sell their homes because they could no longer bear the huge expense. That was Margaret's plan, to drive the residents out so they could sell their homes to Daniel Whitmore's front company at a fraction of the price. I clenched my fists, feeling anger rising at the sight of her brazen face. But the night would not end the way Margaret wanted. I stood up and walked forward, my voice echoing through the chaos in the conference room. Before we vote, I think everyone needs to know what the HOA is really doing with our money. Margaret spun around, her eyes darkening as she noticed I was holding a USB drive. I walked to the conference table and plugged the device into the conference room projector. Numbers from the HOA's official financial statements flashed across the big screen. $75,000 a year for lake maintenance, a lake that had never been dredged or improved. $60,000 a month to Lakeshore Management Services, a company with no employees, no physical office. 3 lakefront homes forced by the HOA, then sold for 30% below market value to Daniel Whitmore's company. The room fell into a heavy silence. Each number was irrefutable evidence. Faces that had initially expressed only annoyance with the HOA turned to genuine anger. Margaret paled but tried to maintain her composure. "This is completely false information," she said quickly, her voice cracking a little. But before Margaret could continue, I pressed play on the video. My security camera footage flashed on the screen. Margaret standing outside my house in the middle of the night with Daniel Whitmore, pointing toward the marina while the man in the black suit jotted something down in a notebook. Then there was the 2 a.m. cargo ships arriving, unloading boxes of unidentified cargo. And finally Margaret receiving a thick envelope from Whitmore. It was the moment I had been waiting for. The door to the conference room swung open. The FBI stormed in. "Margaret Simmons and Daniel Whitmore, you are under arrest for money laundering, fraud, and embezzlement." The room erupted in screams and commotion. Margaret tried to back away, but 2 agents quickly pinned her arms while Whitmore was thrown to the floor. I took one last look at Margaret before she was handcuffed. The arrogant, authoritative facade was gone, replaced by panic and terror. The night had not ended the way she wanted. It had ended the way justice demanded. As the sirens and flashing lights faded into the distance, I stood in the hall, looking around. Lakeshore Estates had finally been freed from the clutches of Margaret Simmons and her accomplices. Residents were still chattering, faces that had previously been filled with anger over the ridiculous HOA fees now filled with relief and hope. After months of fighting, the truth was finally out, but that didn't mean the work was done. Now was the time to repair what they had destroyed. The next day I woke up feeling refreshed, no longer worried about the HOA's intimidation or unwarranted citations. I walked outside to find the iron fence blocking my driveway had been removed. Workers, under orders from the city, had come to remove the barricade that Margaret had erected to try to force me into submission. My driveway was finally open, a symbol of victory not just for me but for the entire community. Within a week, an emergency meeting was held to form a new HOA board. To no one's surprise, Kevin Morris, a neighbor who had been by my side throughout this fight, was elected president. When Kevin stood up to address the community, he didn't have a clipboard or a fake smile like Margaret had, but instead was sincere and resolute. He announced that all HOA fines imposed by the old board would be rescinded immediately. including the ridiculous amount Margaret had tried to force me to pay. Families who had been threatened with unreasonable fees could now breathe a sigh of relief, no longer fearing that they would lose their homes to greedy people. What was even more amazing was that the $2,500,000 embezzled by Margaret and Whitmore was recovered thanks to an FBI investigation. This money was not wasted. Residents voted unanimously to use it for real improvements to the community, rather than just empty promises. The roads would be repaired, the playground rebuilt, the street lights and security systems upgraded, and most importantly, the lake would finally be properly maintained. Under Kevin's leadership, the new HOA also made a significant change. All financial records would be open and transparent. No more shady dealings, no more unwarranted payments to shell companies. Every resident would have access to and oversight of the income and expenses, ensuring that the HOA would truly serve the community, not exploit it. I walked down to the dock at sunset, watching the lake reflect the soft yellow light. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of true peace. No more contentious meetings, no more anxiety when opening the mailbox, no more fear when someone walked by my house with a clipboard. Lakeshore Estates was finally back in the hands of its rightful owners. I sat on a wooden bench by the Lakeshore Estates marina, my feet dangling against the cool floor, the sunset tinting the lake orange. For the first time in months, this neighborhood felt like home. No more tense HOA meetings, no more ridiculous tickets, no more keeping an eye on the security cameras every time someone walked by my house. Just the sounds of laughter, children playing, and the smell of barbecue filling the air. The marina, once a target of greed, now belonged to its rightful owner, the community. Picnic tables lined the dock, families and neighbors gathered around, enjoying the afternoon in a way that had seemed previously unattainable. Small boats gently cut through the water, children rode bicycles along the lakeside path, and a group of adults built a campfire, preparing for an evening of gathering. No more strict rules about who can use this space, no more senior HOA members only, signs like Margaret's suggested. I looked around and my eyes fell on Linda Johnson, one of Margaret Simmons's strongest supporters. She was standing near the dock looking at the water with a puzzled expression. I could see the regret on her face, an expression I thought I would never see again. Finally, she turned and walked toward me, her hands clasped together in hesitation. I remembered clearly how Linda had stood by Margaret's side at HOA meetings, nodding in agreement with every decision Margaret made. Whether it was about unreasonable fees or unreasonable regulations about how many potted plants a resident could have on their porch, she had trusted the wrong person. But now, I could see clearly that trust had been shaken. She stopped in front of me, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Jake, I'm so sorry. I believed Margaret when she said you were just being disruptive, that you wanted to destroy the neighborhood for your own benefit." Her voice was tight. I didn't think it would get this far." I nodded, not needing her to say more. I didn't need an apology. I just needed people to see the truth. Linda sat down next to me, silently observing the marina for a long moment. "I've never seen it this beautiful," she whispered. "We used to be afraid that without a tight HOA things would get messy. But now I realize that sometimes that control makes us lose sight of what's most important." I said nothing, just letting her words hang in the air. Sometimes it's more important to acknowledge a mistake than to avoid it. I looked out at the lake, where the last light of day shimmered on the water. I remembered the moment I first saw the fence across my driveway, the anger and injustice of knowing that the HOA was abusing its power. I never imagined that an unreasonable fence would be the start of a chain of events that would lead to the exposure of a sophisticated criminal network. A seemingly trivial dispute over a stretch of concrete would end up freeing an entire neighborhood from the grip of greed and manipulation. I had started this fight to protect my home, but in the end I had won back so much more. A community awakened, a neighborhood freed, and a lesson that sometimes justice begins in the smallest of ways.